May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. What an astonishing conversation we heard this morning in our reading from Genesis. To set the scene, there's been these three angels, or maybe it's two angels and God, we're never really quite sure. And we've told that they've been meeting with Abraham, and two of them have been sent off to Sodom to find out whether it really is as bad as everyone says. And it leaves Abraham alone with God. And Abraham begins this kind of philosophy game with him, this repartee back and forth. What about 50? What about 45, 40, 30? Oh, well, let me speak just once more, 20, 10. And it's what we could, I think, truly call a dialogue in the kind of ancient philosophical way of speaking, the same as what Plato got up to, or at least what we have recorded of what Plato got up to. And it's what lives on in the way that our politicians thrash out new policy across the ballot box. This back and forth, nudging, arguing, and finally coming to a position. It's a kind of thought experiment in ethics, I like to think. It's a story that the author of Genesis puts in because he wants to create some new ideas in the minds of his readers. It's a kind of teaching story involving a moral dilemma. And Abraham uses that classic slippery slope argument, right, where he goes, well, if 50 is okay, well, what about 45? You know, what's really the difference there? And on and on and on it goes. And I say it's a story with a dilemma, but actually for us, or certainly for me, it's quite difficult to see where that dilemma is. Because when Abraham starts, well, what about 50? I think, well, obviously, I mean, you can't destroy the city for 50 righteous people. That's unjust, right? We don't really know where 50 comes from, the number. One scholar suggests that perhaps an average-sized city would have had 100 fighting men. And, of course, at the time, fighting men are the only ones who really count. So 50 would have been like saying, what if half of the city is righteous and half unrighteous? What then? What then, God? Would you still destroy it? And, of course, he works his way down, 45, 40. But by that point, I've already skipped ahead, and I'm thinking, well, if there's one righteous person, that's not fair, right? If God destroys the city, if there's one righteous person. So it doesn't really seem to be a moral dilemma to me, which makes me wonder why on earth this story is in there in the first place. What's the writer hoping to achieve? And I think the clue to that is in the first verse that we read, verse 20. Then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. And if we think about that, that sounds kind of very strange to our ears. What if I said to you, how great is the outcry against Madrid? Or how very grave the sin of Hadley? Or the United Kingdom is unrighteous? Those phrases don't kind of sound quite right, because we use the words sin and righteousness to talk about individuals. We don't talk about the entirety of a country. There might be unrighteous people in the United Kingdom, but to call the United Kingdom itself unrighteous doesn't really kind of make sense with the way that we do our thinking. Partly, I think that's because of our legal system. We have a legal system where one person has to be guilty of the crime. You can't send an institution to jail. You can only do that to a person. And the flaw of that system, I think, was highlighted fairly recently in all of the goings-on around the banking crisis. It's not that there was kind of one mastermind, evil tyrant over the whole lot, right, who was saying, Dr. Evil style, moo ha 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 ha, if I position these pieces all in the right place, the whole thing will collapse. It was just people carrying out their jobs in a corrupt institution brought the whole thing down. So this story, I think, is speaking into a context very different to our own, a context where the expected way of understanding sin is corporate. We often read things like Israel was blameless in the sight of God, or on the other hand, Israel did not follow the commandments of God. Well, I mean, surely there were some people who did follow them, some people who didn't. But it didn't sound strange to the Hebrews at the time to say, even if there were some who were righteous and some who were not, that collectively they were unrighteous. So the story is set in a context where the author understands corporate sin as being the main way of understanding sin, and he's trying to say to the people, well, what do you think about this idea of individual sin? Might that be something that we could catch on? Is that something we need to work on? For us, I think really it's the other way round. I mean, we do individual sin no problem at all. The thing we forget about is this idea of institutional sin, corporate unrighteousness. And the literature suggests that this is alive and well, and something that really we should be paying more attention to. There's a sociologist, a psychologist, I'm not quite sure how he classifies himself, called Philip Zimbardo. He's an American, retired now, and he wrote a very influential and important book and carried out a number of studies. The book's called The Lucifer Effect, and his studies were about what happens when you put normal people in difficult situations. And I want to just relate a couple of his experiments. The first one, he gets two cars, 10-year-old cars at the time of the experiment, and he puts one in a neighbourhood where there's lots of degenerated infrastructure. There's smashed windows, there's graffiti. He puts the other car in a much more salubrious neighbourhood. There's no litter on the ground, everything's nicely polished. And he removes the number plates from both the cars and he props the bonnets up. And he says that this is a kind of sign that maybe they've been abandoned, and it lets people know that no one really has ownership of these vehicles. Well, 3 days in, and the car in the area with the broken windows and the graffiti has been vandalised 23 times, been stripped of everything that's worth anything. A week later, the car in the salubrious area, the only thing that's happened is one man's gone up and put the bonnet down because it started raining. Now, of course, it's not that one area is populated with only unrighteous people and the other with only righteous people. To prove this fact, Zimbardo goes back and he smashes with a sledgehammer the window on the car that hasn't been touched in the salubrious area. Sure enough, a few days later, the whole thing's been stripped. And what he suggests this story is telling us, or this experiment is telling us, is that there are things all around us which unconsciously give us permission to act unrighteously, or conversely, prevent us from doing so. This has become called the broken window theory of criminology, and it's the thing that sparked neighbourhood watches. Actually, this theory, the idea that if there are people supposedly kind of watching out for one another, it's just less likely that crime will happen, because unconsciously anyone thinking about committing a crime will be moved against it. He does an even more powerful experiment. He takes a couple of dozen 20 to 25-year-old men. Some of them are in college, which is university over in the States. Some of them are working, just a cross-section of society. And he randomly assigns half of them as prisoners and half of them as guards. And he wants to see how quickly they slot into the roles that he's told them they're meant to be. So he goes around and he doesn't tell the prisoners when they're going to be captured, and he gets a local police force to pretend that they're really arresting them and takes them off to this lab, basically. And he gets all the guards together and they discuss how they want to do their guarding. Well, 24 hours in, by the first night, the guards have stripped the prisoners naked and they're getting them doing jumping jacks. They're waking them up every 2 hours. The second day, they've started hitting them with billy clubs. These are just kids who, the previous week, could have been sitting in a bar having a drink together. They've been told that half of you are meant to be prisoners and half of you are meant to be guards. And in as little as 2 days, they've so incorporated that into their actions that they're physically and sexually abusing one another. It's absolutely mind-blowing stuff. Zimbardo concludes that evil deeds are rarely the product of evil people acting from evil motives. He says they're the product of good bureaucrats simply doing their job. It's a scary thought that there are things that just give us unconsciously permission to act unrighteously. So this story, I think, is in Genesis because the author is wanting his audience to take individual sin more seriously. What we should take from it, I think, is the idea that we need to take corporate sin more seriously. As Christians, we have a slightly different understanding of individual sin. Abraham goes from 50 to 45, 40, 30, 20, and he stops at 10 because his point is made, right? That even if there's one righteous person, surely he won't destroy it. For Christians, it's a little bit different. We have to ask the question, well, what if there are no righteous people? Paul writes in the 3rd chapter of Romans, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It's a tough question for us. We can see what's fair about the righteous person being spared and the rest destroyed. It's more difficult when we think that there are no righteous people. And our great proclamation as Christians is that it's only by the grace of Christ that we have the opportunity to be called righteous. We can't be called righteous because of any works that we do of our own. We're called righteous because of the atoning sacrifice of Christ, because of his death and because of his resurrection. My takeaway today then is to remember that individual sin is just part of the picture. That institutionalized unrighteousness, that corporate sin, is something that we forget all too easily. It's what Paul calls helping your brother and sister to stumble. What might cause your brother and sister to stumble? So I ask you to think about your own lives, not where you're getting things wrong, but where the things that you're doing are helping to bring about circumstances in which it's inevitable that your neighbours will stumble. What are the things you're doing that help bring about circumstances where it's inevitable that your neighbours will fall into sin? Amen.